Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I am Desa Seeley, the Acting Deputy Commissioner of the GSA Public Building Service. In this final segment of our program, we will review this afternoon's salient points and plot a course for future federal design investments. Our roundtable includes Ned Cramer, founding editor-in-chief of Architect magazine, and who previously served as the first full-time curator of the Chicago Architecture Foundation. Paul Farmer is Chief Executive Officer of the American Planning Association and President of the Planning Foundation. Brad McKee was named Editor-in-Chief of Landscape Architecture 2010, and he has since overseen an exciting overhaul of the magazine. As its Executive Vice President and CEO, Nancy Somerville has spearheaded the American Society of Landscape Architects' participation in the launch of the Sustainable Sites Initiative. And Susan Szenasy heads Metropolis magazine, and she is a senior fellow of the Design Futures Council. Our panelists will respond to this afternoon's many interesting threads: the adaptability of the guiding principles, motivations for improving public design, whether government encourages innovation, practices that can expand design culture in federal agencies. And at the conclusion of this roundtable, we'll have some additional closing remarks by Les Shepard. To all of you, thank you for recapping today's dialogue and for improving the quality of federal design and construction. I want to note that we invited colleagues to make comments on their additions to rewrites of thoughts about the guiding principles and to make them relevant for the next 50 years. Marilyn referenced several of them, and these comments can be found at Moynihan Symposium.us under the Looking Forward tab. And to kick things off, I'll just say that a couple of things stood out to me in the last several panels. One was the question of who is the next Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So I'm very interested in finding out, the answer to that and how we cultivate Daniel Patrick Moynihans, particularly in this time of very tense tensions politically. And then on the following panel, there was the question of what is the next Carnegie Library, which was also a fascinating sort of thing to contemplate. If we're not going to continue to build the old Carnegie libraries, what's next? And then this concept of physical, which we're very familiar with, and social infrastructure, and how we increase our responsiveness. Thanks very much, and look forward to a very exciting summary and your own thoughts as well.
Thank you. So I'd like to start the wrap. And one of the things, I am not sure that we can even think about the next Daniel Patrick Moynihan, because I think we might be thinking about teams, really skilled people coming together and working together. It's sort of the way of the new generation working together with very finely honed skills in order to create big solutions to big complex problems. And so I think we may have to rethink the personality cult, and we may want to think more about relationships. The other thing, there are many things, and one of the things that I'd like to start with is the issue of durability needs a contemporary interpretation. And that's a really interesting thought for me, because I'm looking at industrial designers and how they're looking at design for disassembly, and how they understand that the product, if it doesn't last forever, if that kind of design is not long-lived, how does it become the part of the material stream, and how does it build the next generation of product and become the part of the expression? And I've seen some very few and very tentative moves in architecture about this design for disassembly. And I think that's something that we need to think about very hard. How do we take apart our buildings? How are they built in the first place, designed so that they can be taken apart? And I just want to give you one little example, a very low-tech example, but I think We are now in the process of building from the low tech and up to the high tech and the combination of the two. I remember going back to Hungary when I was in my 20s after I grew up in New Jersey. And at that moment, they were taking down the old barn brick by brick to build my uncle's house. And so the brick adapted itself for that kind of rebuilding. And it became a beautiful little house that still serves now the third generation of my family. And so I think we have to think about that. We have to think about our materials, our processes in a very different way, in a very organic way, very inclusive way. And it's no longer enough just to sort of call something green and something sustainable, but we really have to think about the system. So I'd like to start with the systems thinking that goes into design for disassembly, which means the durability in contemporary architecture does not have to be the building itself, but the materials need to have several lives.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I would start with three points I would want to make to start. And the first one is, having read the principles and then having listened to the dialogue we've had already today, it just reinforces what a remarkable legacy that Senator Moynihan left for federal design. I mean, the words are still so enduring. And it's clear that we have some challenges to be true to that legacy and take it forward, and a lot of the dialogue was about that. A couple of the areas that came out, one, which we definitely have not solved, and I wanted to bring back, is security. We have not solved that. There have been a lot of efforts to do that, and certainly a lot of recognition that we have to find a way to solve that. And it will take a lot of innovation and maybe some more technology, some things that solutions that we haven't found yet. But we have not found it. We are still busy bollardizing and using pot bunkers as a way to protect buildings. And if Bob Peck were here, he'd also talk about the fact that Justice Breyer was correct that leadership can be helpful with that, but Bob Peck always referred to security envy, which is also something that happens at people who are the heads of agencies when the buildings on either side of you are getting security reinforcements. Why isn't my building getting a security reinforcement? That's a problem at the leadership level. We unfortunately have more of that than of the Stephen Breyers who are willing to stand up and say, no, the public needs to come in, there's another way to do this. So we haven't solved it, and we need to look at that. We've touched on a little bit, and it was even there embodied in what Moynihan said when he talked about good design and site and context. But good design does have to be sustainable design. That's certainly been recognized. And I'll use Harriet Tregoning's preferred term, if you like, high performance buildings. But high performance buildings can't be high performance unless the site and the landscape on which they sit are high performance. And we had some fabulous dialogue today about the responsibility of the buildings, the site, the landscape to the communities they're in, including how transportation relates, how the socioeconomic life of the city, the community, the fabric all relates, is a very important part of that. But we can't otherwise take our eye off the issue of sustainability. GSA and a lot of the federal agencies have really been a model, and it has been very important for them to be a model. They really have. The federal government has a sustainability imperative. They have to be a model in this area. And that has to start happening in terms of site and landscape as well. We know now the damage that happens to our communities, to the watersheds, to the environment, simply by paving over the landscape. We know that. We also know that there's a lot of innovation and ways to bring the natural systems back into what we're doing. There's another way to build. But we haven't quite moved into that paradigm. So that's a challenge for us moving forward and continuing to make the Senator's principles relevant into the future.
I want to jump right to the question of who is the next Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And I would venture that person is probably Mayor Michael Bloomberg in New York, who has shown really remarkable leadership, especially in terms of open space, in turning the water's edge in that city into what they call the sixth borough. And there are, I know, a lot of landscape architects especially, and urban designers who are very nervous about succession of the mayorship when he leaves office, because he's given tremendous support to the Parks Department, recreation facilities, to agencies like the Governor's Island Trust. He wants a park within 10 minutes walk of everyone's home or school. So I'm going to say that he's working at a local level in a fairly low-key way, because you don't hear Mayor Bloomberg really tooting his own horn very much about public space. I think he has a lot of other people doing that for him. But life has improved so much in New York City over the past 10 years that I think any objection I would have ever had to living there has now been resolved. So that would be my choice for the candidate of a successor to Moynihan, and Senator Moynihan, and perhaps after he leaves office, he can be as or more effective in the role he's taken up in office.
Well, thanks. I'd like to touch on several things that I've heard over the course of the afternoon, and let me start with a point made by Justice Breyer. He talked a lot about the need for a good client, a client who was informed, a client who recognized that time needed to be spent. And I certainly agree with that. I think the challenge is that often when we're dealing with a client for public buildings, the client is doing it for the first time, and often they're doing it for the last time. The chief judge, for example, is the real client when it comes to a courthouse. Most chief judges never do more than one courthouse, and most of them have never done a building before they do the courthouse. So there's a real challenge in terms of how we approach clients, and is there any opportunity for client education or something of that nature when we're talking about the amount of money that we spend on an annual basis. And that gets even broader if you go to things like the discussion about whether infrastructure should be added to the list of what we're talking about when we're looking at federal design. While having a good client's important, having a good architect is also important. And in my days in Pittsburgh, when we were doing a lot of development, we had Jonathan Barnett as our urban design consultant. We used to write a very brief 2 or 3 pages of planning and urban design criteria for major development projects. And Jonathan always joked, or at least sort of half joked, that the first guideline should always be hire a good architect. If you have an architect that's not so good and then you come up with a set of guidelines, you're still going to have a long journey, let us call it, at best. And I think that the challenge here is that when I say good architect, I don't just mean a blanket qualitative judgment. A lot of architects have a style. A style may be appropriate for one building, but not another. It may often be appropriate for one site, but not another. And so that selection process that Breyer also talked about, I think is very important, of kind of asking the right questions and thinking of how the relationship will lead to a good building for a program, as Kairos talked about, but also for a site. That gets into the issue of context that's been touched on several times today. But the context, I think, is something that often gets lost in the design of kind of what's a good building. And the issues of security we've talked about make that issue of dealing with the context even more difficult. The site selection is something that is touched on briefly in the Moynihan Principles. Number 3, the choice and development of the building site, so the choice of the building site. I think we need to give a lot more attention to the choice of a site. And if there's one real criticism I would make of the last 50 years of federal building, it is in site selection. Often the sites are selected without much analysis. They're decided on prematurely. And then you've got to figure out how to make the building work for a site that is probably the wrong one in the first place. And the final thing I would add is emotion. You've heard people talk about government should inspire. Walter Hood said that. He also added later places where people want to go. Those are not just some type of an intellectual understanding of the function of a building. Okay, this is where I go to get my driver's license at the state level or whatever it may be. But it really does get into the way people emotionally respond to their environment and respond to buildings. And I think that one of the challenges there is the issue of scale. When the principles were written 50 years ago, most of our buildings were at a scale that's quite different from what we see today. Even on the retail side, we all like to think about the wonderful retail streets that are so successful from yesteryear. Well, those retail streets often had shops where the doors were every 20 or 30 feet because that was the scale of commerce at that time. I don't think I've seen a Walgreens or a CVS recently where you could put a door every 20 or 30 feet. It's the same when we're looking at public buildings. Courthouses today are far, far larger than they were 50, 75 years ago. Most of the federal office buildings are far larger. When we look at defense installations today, we see things. And so when you start dealing with that issue of scale, you are challenged then with creating places that people want to go to, places where people feel comfortable and not feel overwhelmed. I sat through a public presentation about 15 years ago in Oregon when the city of Eugene was getting ready to build a courthouse that ultimately was built. And after seeing a number of pictures of the types of courthouses being built around the country that were meant to inspire, a member of the public walked up to the microphone and said something that I thought was quite insightful. They said, "Is it the intent of the federal government to make the American citizen feel insignificant?" And I don't think that we intend to make the American citizen feel insignificant. I think that's what we do often when you look at the buildings that we built. And that gets to that issue of emotional response. Monumentalism is appropriate at times. And I will end with, again, going back to what Stephen Breyer talked about, which is the brilliance of the Cass Gilbert design, the brilliance of the procession up those steps to engage in the business of the public, to engage in the business of citizens, even though there are 9 justices sitting there in their robes. And so I think that we should not lose sight of the emotional response that people inevitably have to anything that we build. And how do we perhaps do a better job of anticipating and designing the emotional response that we really intend, as opposed to the unintentional ones that we so often get.
I was intrigued by a number of topics that didn't come up, and didn't come up in a sense in a good way, because it means they're no longer preoccupations for those who have a stake in the built environment and the federal government as a steward of the built environment. So, for instance, I was delighted that architects were not the center of conversation and buildings themselves were not the center of conversation, but that instead, as represented actually or demonstrated by the fact of the 5 of us being on this panel, I'm the only representative of the architecture profession, but we have landscape, we have the editor of a multidisciplinary magazine, and the head of the APA, goes to show that it is no longer simply about the building as an object, and that when we think about the construction of federal projects, we can no longer afford to ignore everything around that building. Another thing that didn't come up that I thought was really remarkable, or didn't come up often, is the question of style. Alan Greenberg, I think in the very first panel, was asked by Paul Goldberger how he felt classicism sort of did or rated as a contemporary style for federal architecture today. And it was interesting. Alan Greenberg basically ignored the question and talked about how, the founding fathers, people like Jefferson, what their ideals were, and not how they were thinking about style, but how they were thinking about symbol and meaning and emotional response to architecture. So for him, it wasn't a question of style. Alan Greenberg, who was sort of the anointed classicist for today, for him, it was much more a question of the effectiveness of a piece of architecture, how you feel, what it says, and acknowledging that one can do that in any number of ways, right? And this word context got used a great deal in lieu of the word style, which is to say that a project should be suited to the place where it's built. So there was no talk of kind of cookie cutter approaches to individual buildings. We're not talking about prototypes in a negative way, getting duplicated ad infinitum. The last thing, and this is something that actually was said that I found quite fascinating, was in the second panel and the conversation about federal architecture is so often kind of distinct and isolated and singular in purpose. And the notion that, for instance, in Boston, the public library might actually incorporate retail at its base, the idea that multiple public agencies might actually collaborate, identify areas of overlap in program or areas of need, and have facilities that are not just mixed use, which in and of itself is a bit of a challenge for federal building, but would actually be buildings of multiple use, where, for instance, at different times of day, different audiences and users might be occupying the same space, applying that space to different needs. So for me, it was as much about sort of things that are received wisdom didn't get mentioned, which tells me that maybe we're beginning to think in more innovative ways when we think about federal architecture, public place, and the expenditure of public money.
So I'd like to add to that, the site selection doesn't only apply to the Moynihan directive, but to every architectural project, because we see this all the time everywhere, that the site is ignored, there's still the planters plop down, there's still the landscaping is at the minimum, the connectivity to the neighborhood is at a minimum. So I think the federal guidelines, actually the Moynihan guidelines, actually help everybody to think about the architecture in the US and how do we build neighborhoods. And that leads me to the question about the what's the next Carnegie Library. And to me, the next Carnegie Library is really basically the tightly planned urban neighborhood that is human scale, that is all about connecting people, connecting services, connecting what they do, connecting the landscape, connecting them with nature and the built environment together. So how does that nugget of a place that also has district energy, which produces its energy, recycles its water, it creates its own ecosystem. And I think that might be a really, really interesting new way of looking at things, bringing in all of these skills that this panel has, everybody in this audience has, and I think that might be a really interesting thing to start thinking about seriously. We talk a lot about it. We don't see enough of this. We don't see enough of the natural processes being brought into the built environment that I think this kind of systemic rethinking will help us do. So, I think if this next Carnegie Library model, the new neighborhood, creates the places where people love to be, it will resemble the Carnegie Library in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where I grew up and learned to read English. I mean, it's one of those places where people have a real relationship to. So how do we find that relationship in our new neighborhoods and in the connectivity of the neighborhoods where people of every age live, people of all skills live? I think I just got 3 books in the mail that is about building for seniors. I know that my generation do not want to be built for seniors. We do not want to be thrown away. Nobody does. And I think we have to think about that kind of inclusivity that America has taught us, that this is where we are an interconnected people who really need one another and who are the very best when we do work together. And I think the remark that we are at our best when during times of disaster is because our humanity comes out at that time. And we leave our humanity hidden most of the time, that we're not using it as a kind of communication system, as a relational system. So I think we have to figure out how to teach ourselves to not to be reactive, but proactive in creating these very positive places that we all know and we have the skills to do now. And this idea that all of us are talking together is incredibly powerful. And when you think about the power of all of these various skills together, in the next 5 to 10 years, we can see some amazing changes in our built environment. And so getting back to Moynihan's site selection, that takes it to the next level. We don't have to rewrite it. He's saying it. We just have to practice it in a different way.
And that takes the team you were talking about before. It has to have everyone involved in that. Not somewhere along the line you get everyone involved. You get everyone involved right at the beginning.
That's right. And if you think about the idea of multiple voices of teams coming together, there are many ways that that can happen. There's obviously at the level of an individual project, at the level of an individual urban plan, but it's also at the level of lobbying in government. I think about the fact we asked who the next Daniel Patrick Moynihan is. We haven't asked who the next Andrew Carnegie is, right? Because those are actually privately funded, privately initiated buildings. And in many ways, we have to be the change we want to be. And if that means, a kind of lobbying partnership between, I'm putting you on the spot, APA and the ASLA and the AIA.
We do that.
Exactly. That's the kind of collective, collaborative effort that I think is necessary before we can expect the federal government as clients to accept and want the kind of services that we want to provide, right? With the kind of vision that we're hoping to inspire for community.
So while we're on the issue of community, I'd like to bring in the resources that America has in its smaller cities. These are potentially creative cauldrons for the next solutions. Large cities can do neighborhood fixes, and New York has certainly done some amazing things. And we have this rogue transportation commissioner who will just tear apart the streets and make the bike lanes happen and lie down in front of the bulldozers and do all of that, which we need. But I think what's very interesting is that I travel to a lot of American cities that have such incredible resources in terms of the architecture that hasn't been torn down for urban renewal. The architecture is there to build into and on and add to and create a whole new sense of place in those places that have real history that no longer have that because it always centered around manufacturing, around jobs, around water, around all those 19th century resources that built these cities. And yet they are very strong and great government buildings. Their government buildings are always standouts. So how do the small cities become these creative cauldrons for example of urban development, smaller scale, tighter urban development, and not claim the land around them, but pull together and create really important centers of innovation in the urban realm and in the quality of life. So that's sort of a really interesting question for us to ponder, for all of you to ponder.
Well, one of the ways right now that the federal government is involved in some of these broader issues, Susan, that you're raising, is through the base realignment and closure process, the BRAC process. And we've now gone through several cycles of that. And it's involved both in terms of the disposition of those properties, in terms of kind of who gets them in for what purposes and how is that handled. And I think, again, that the guiding principles ought to be redone with those in mind, because those are major, large-scale urban regeneration projects that are occurring typically in an already developed environment. And it's going to make a major change one way or another in that environment. The other, of course, is the other end of that. And we've seen that here in Washington, D.C., where there are, part of the base realignment and closure is where are the new things going to be built. And because of, I think, some ill-advised security conclusions that we've reached, a lot of those are being put out in greenfield sites. And so those are going to be the next generation